Welcome to this video. This video will be an introduction to environmental history and policy. The learning targets for this video are: I can identify trends in data related to the use of renewables for electricity generation. I can develop questions about environmental policy related to the use of renewables for electricity generation. I can differentiate between the ideas of conservation and preservation using the national parks as examples, and I can identify major events in the environmental policy timeline. So just to start out and get the stage set, we're going to look at a little bit of data from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, from 2012. And what this map shows is it shows global renewable energy that's used for electricity. So you can see in any of the countries that are a darker shade of green that they are using a higher percentage of renewable energy sources for generating electricity. And those that are in lighter green, such as the United States, much of Europe and Asia, are using a lower percentage of renewables for generating electricity. Now, this is one of the problems that we're having in terms of environmental policy, and that is to really identify what the shift needs to be in terms of renewables, other energy sources that we can use to generate things like electricity. So let's look now just at data from the United States. And again, this data is from the EIA. And this data shows us from 1990 to present with a projection out to 2040. So it shows us the historical data on the left side of the chart. On the far right side of the chart, we can see data for natural gas, coal, renewables, nuclear, and other in a scenario where there is no clean power plan in effect. And the data set in the middle shows us for a clean power plan in effect those same resources. Some of the interesting features that we see here represented in the data are trends for natural gas and for coal. So you can see that natural gas is replacing coal in a lot of the electricity generation. And then, in fact, many of the coal power plants have been converted to natural gas because it is a little bit cleaner burning and doesn't emit as much CO2. Another interesting trend is that nuclear is largely flat across the entire timeline. And additionally, it's interesting to note that renewables do increase pretty steadily from about 2010 into 2040 projections, but they flatline just a bit in the no clean power plan scenario versus the clean power plan scenario. So I'd like you to think about what the impact overall of the clean power plan would be, and ask yourself if there are any other questions you'd like to ask about this data. I'm going to turn our conversation now to thinking about the precursors of environmental policy, so thinking about conservation and preservation. In fact, prior to the formation of the national parks, so in the late 1800s, much of the U.S. in its early history had kind of a frontier attitude that dominated the exploration. And that attitude really was, we'll use the resources to profit in any way that we can. And not until we had people coming onto the scene like Audubon and Thoreau and Muir and even Rachel Carson later on, did we really start to think about conservation and preservation. So comparing and contrasting those two terms, conservation really focuses on the sensible and careful management of natural resources, while preservation focuses on maintaining something in its original or pristine state. So we can look at some of that early work. 1872, when Congress first established our first national park, Yellowstone. You see 3 images here of Yellowstone. And between 1872 and the current time, 59 national parks have been dedicated and are operated by the National Park Service under the Department of the Interior. The criteria for selection of these parks for conservation and preservation are that they are natural beauties, that they have unique geologic features, unusual ecosystems, and they offer recreational opportunities. All of this work led up to 1970, the creation of the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and later in that same year, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And I'd like you to sit here and just for a second read with me the statement or the law, the code that created the NEPA. So it was to declare a national policy which would encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere and stimulate the health and welfare of man, to enrich the understanding of ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation, and to establish a council on environmental quality. So the reason I wanted to specifically read that with you is because in a minute we're going to see a slide that shows us a timeline of the legislation that's been passed since 1970 up until the early 2000s that is environmental legislation. And I think much of the wording that's represented here in this law is certainly observed in those various different policies that were passed. So here we go. Starting in 1970 with NEPA and the EPA being created. 1970 also, the Clean Air Act. 74, the Safe Drinking Water Act. 76, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Also in 76, the Toxic Substances Control Act. 1977, the Clean Water Act. 1980, the Environmental Response and Liability Act. Check out Superfunds there. 1990, the Oil Pollution Act, and 1996, the Food Quality Protection Act. So that's a basic timeline of the major pollution control laws that were passed, and I do think they reflect what's said in the NEPA's forming statement. Thanks for joining me in this video. Please take the Mastery Check quiz located on the website right to the right side of the video. See you in class.